the Institute on Religion and Democracy, and we're in the IRD's offices. And IRD is a co-publisher of Providence, a journal of Christianity and American foreign policy, in collaboration with the Philos Project. And this is our monthly social hour. And if this is your first time with us, we're so glad that you found us, or that we found you. And we hope to see you again. But Providence, which was founded in 2015, with the purpose of helping Christians better understand issues regarding international relations, American foreign policy, national security, somewhat in the tradition of Reinhold Niebuhr and the school of thought associated with Christian realism. So we welcome you to this conversation, which this evening will be led by the Reverend Matthew Anderson, who is a professor in the theology department at Georgetown University and is ordained in the Anglican Church, previously pastored at a very vital church on Capitol Hill, a few of whose members are here in the audience. But Matthew has become an expert on Mideast issues, especially Egypt, having studied and spent a great deal of time in Egypt and also in Jordan. But he'll be speaking to us this evening about Christians in Egypt for about 15 minutes, after which there'll be plenty of time for questions and comments. And then we'll have a brief announcement from our partners with the Philos Project, and then our reception will resume with whatever food and drink we have left at that point. I should say, if you're here for the first time and you're not on our Evite invitation list, please be sure to leave us your email address so we can invite you in the future. And I have a special appreciation for all of you who were not intimidated by the sinister forces of the weather and did everything they could to deter your attendance. So obviously you prevailed in that form of spiritual warfare involving the weather. But Matthew, glad you could be with us and to journey all the way from Georgetown University campus to be here this evening. Although, did you come from Charlottesville?
I did
directly?
actually come from Charlottesville.
So we appreciate that very much. But please welcome Matthew Anderson.
I'm wondering if this is working. Is it working?
Is that
It
audible?
doesn't particularly matter to me if it is, but it's maybe working now. So is that better? Is that better for people?
No, it's fine.
I mean, I love to hear the sound of my own voice, so I'm happy for it to be working now. Yeah, so thank you so much, Mark, for inviting me to participate in these forums. I was, I guess, at a social hour recently with Providence earlier this summer and enjoyed it, and have known Mark for a long time and appreciated the work of the Institute on Religion and Democracy.
Yes.
On
Not
religion.
for.
On, okay. And also the kind of relatively new project of Providence, which I guess has been around for a few years now. And I suppose I wanted to start just by saying how some of my experiences really in Egypt sort of really awakened in me a sense of how important these kinds of questions are on the relationship between religion and the state, religion and government, religion and public life. And as Mark said, I was a minister here in Washington for a number of years. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. For a number of years in the 2000s, from about 2004 to 2009. And like all of us, I kind of came to the city interested in the questions that would bring us to an event like this tonight. But you know, I think there was something missing in my approach to these questions. And that really, that sort of the impetus for a much more serious engagement was really provided by my experience in Egypt, in particular being there in 2011 for the Egyptian Revolution. And I worked there from 2009 to 2011 in the Anglican church there, and I taught theology. But it just so happened, and I was still very naive about really the nature of Egypt and the kinds of things going on there, but the revolution erupted, and I was downtown in this one part of Cairo they call Zamalek. Many of you will be familiar with it. And just to see the kind of surging political and religious and cultural forces that were revealed during those days, and was incredibly transformative experience for me, in good ways. There were moments of fear, of course, and there was a moment where I sort of, had some tear gas kind of waft into my face, and I mentioned that to somebody, and they said, that's got to be the first chapter in your autobiography. I said, I don't know really, actually, if I'm going to be writing one of those, but I think to see the humanity of Egypt on display, actually, in those days, those months, the creativity of the country, the patriotism of the country, the humanity. So that was a really huge thing. At the same time, we witnessed a lot of other things. We witnessed the kind of emergence, really, in public view in a way that perhaps had not been the case for some decades of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the tensions and the problems between, say, the Islamists, the military, what we might loosely call the secular or liberal kind of faction. And watching all of that unfold really demonstrated to me the significance of the kinds of questions that I've gone on to study in a lot of ways, and sort of helped push me and guide me somewhat through my studies at Georgetown. And give me an appreciation for what you guys are trying to do here at our IRD. Let me just, as far as my history in Egypt, I lived there for 2 years. I have gone back several times since. The last kind of journeys I've taken there, I've been working with an organization over there called the Center for Arab West Understanding, which is an organization that's been headed up by a Dutch sociologist named Cornelis Holzman. Some very interesting work that we've done together, some of which we'll talk about tonight. So I keep, I'm very much engaged. I was there for a month this summer. I was there for 2 months last summer, and looking at some possibilities for the future. We'll see what happens. But in thinking about what I wanted to say tonight, there are a lot of directions we could go, but I wanted to try to sort of give you some unique insights on the nature of the Christian experience in Egypt, and also on the nature of Christian-Muslim relations in Egypt. This is not an easy thing to do for a lot of different reasons. One of them is people really disagree about the Christian experience in Egypt. And one of the things that I thought might be helpful is just to kind of talk briefly about some of the narratives that you will encounter, or many of you, given your interest, will have already encountered. Some of the narratives that you'll encounter if you're trying to understand what's going on in Egypt. And I guess one thing to say about this is there's a multiplicity of narratives. And that's kind of the first step, to my mind, of understanding or trying to understand what's happening in Egypt, is to realize there are multiple views of what's actually transpiring. And to get a sense of those can be helpful. Now, I'm going to give you four kind of narratives to start with. And I want to be clear, these are not meant to be comprehensive. There are other narratives that you could probably come up with, maybe off the top of your head. They're not meant to be, I'm not going to be evaluating them particularly in the sense of saying which one is actually true and which one is actually false, though some of the things I say will probably give some indication of kind of where I stand on that, but that's not really the point either. The point is to kind of expose you to what types of narratives there are on the country, and particularly as it relates to Christian-Muslim relations. The first narrative that I want to suggest to you that is present is what I would call the religious and national unity narrative. Now, on this view, which is promoted by the government, which is promoted by the media in many cases, a lot of religious leadership, both Christian and Muslim, and believed by a lot of people on the streets of Egypt, is this idea that Christians and Muslims, or Copts and Muslims, because Copts, of course, are the Coptic Church is the largest group of Christians in Egypt, have pretty good relations. They're not perfect, but they're pretty good, and both stand together for the country. And so this is kind of a kind of religious and national unity narrative. That the relations, they're not perfect, but they're pretty good, and both of these groups are standing together for the country. And on this view, the main enemy of the kind of well-being of Egypt, of course, is sort of radical extremism, religious extremism, jihadist terrorism, who are on the fringes, very far fringes of the society, whereas everybody else, though things aren't perfect, are getting along, relatively well. Now, as I said, you'll find, like, for example, a lot of middle or upper class Muslims will believe this. You'll find Christians, even if they don't, in my experience, fully believe it's accurate, they might think it's useful for the country to believe this. But this is a very common vision of what's happening in Egypt. And if you've interacted with people in Egypt, you're going to encounter it. Or if you've interacted with people even writing about Egypt. A second narrative that I want to suggest exists is what I call the Christian or Coptic diaspora narrative. These words are chosen very carefully, so let me unpack them a little bit. This view basically says that what's really happening in Egypt is that Christians, and Coptic Christians in particular, are systematically and discriminated against. And even there's open persecution. And that the government, rather than being this kind of bulwark of unity, rather is often apathetic to the plight of Christians or Copts, if not complicit sometimes in sort of the persecution or the discrimination. Now, I say Coptic diaspora or Christian diaspora because this view kind of has some of its most eloquent and persuasive proponents that are living outside of Egypt. A lot actually are active, I think, in the politics of the United States. I was talking to a friend of mine who lives in Egypt yesterday about this, and he said, well, don't Christians inside Egypt also have that view? And I do think that's true. I think a lot of Christians in Egypt would articulate that is basically the reality, that there's a lot of discrimination, a lot of persecution. However, if they're living within Egypt, it's going to be the case that it's going to be a slightly more balanced perspective, if I could put it that way. Or let me say, it's going to have other themes that are emphasized. For example, the religious and national unity theme will be emphasized by people living there. Some people would say, well, the reason that's the case is because they're not free to say what they really think. But whatever the case is, this is a kind of second narrative. It paints a much more dire picture. A third narrative is what I would call the political Islamist narrative. Again, these words are chosen fairly carefully. And the political Islamist narrative would say something like, Egypt is a Muslim majority country. It's 90% of the population is Muslim. It has in its constitutional legacy a very explicit statement that the state religion is Islam. This actually goes back even to the 1923 Constitution, which is kind of viewed as a product of the kind of golden liberal age of Egypt. Even there, in that Constitution, it actually says that Islam is the state religion. But that became more pronounced as the Constitution continued to be developed and rewritten. So in 1971, 1980, 2014, these constitutions had a much more explicit statement along these lines that Egypt was to be kind of governed primarily, or its law, the basis of its legal system was primarily the Sharia. And there's a lot to be said about that. There's a lot of dispute about what that exactly means, but it's there. And the political Islamist narrative would say something like along the lines of Christians are welcome or respected here, religious minorities are respected here, but they need to know their place within Egyptian society. And for a lot of political Islamists, the problem would not be Copts or Christians per se, but the fact that Copts or Christians are seen to kind of unreservedly support what the Islamists consider to be authoritarian and oppressive regime. That can create real problems. And I think you saw that actually, say, in 2013 when Mohamed Morsi was removed from office, and all of a sudden you have this kind of conflagration of church burnings happening in 2013. Part of the way to read what was going on there is the sense that the Coptic and the Christian communities were supporting this act, and therefore they should be punished for it. So that's a third narrative. A fourth narrative that you'll encounter if you're coming across and trying to understand this country is what I would call the international human rights narrative, which is kind of talked about, proposed by various human rights organizations, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, others, which would say, yes, Copts are persecuted, yes, Christians are persecuted, but so is everybody else. And the real problem is that there's a corrupt and authoritarian regime that is determined to keep political and economic control over the country. So these are four narratives that if you've spent any time trying to understand Egypt, I trust you'll recognize them. And again, my point really is not to evaluate them at this juncture, but I would say this, that depending on where you stand, and depending on what evidences you want to consider, or that you are considering, each of these narratives can seem plausible. And that's what makes understanding the country so complicated. And I would venture to say that if you want to really kind of understand what's happening in Egypt, you have to kind of realize that these different narratives, realize that they're shaping what people are saying about the country, and try to kind of take them into consideration as you push into more detailed appreciation of what's actually happening. My own view would be that to kind of just buy into one narrative completely of the ones that I presented and leave the others completely out of consideration will inevitably lead to a kind of distorted vision of what's happening. So those are some narratives. Now I wanted to say, and hopefully I'm sure you might have a few questions about those narratives, I'd be happy to answer them. But I wanted to kind of talk more directly about Christians in Egypt. What's their experience like in the light of these swirling narratives? And so I wanted to begin with a couple of kind of observations that I think are pretty important. One observation I'd begin with is that there is no single monolithic experience of Egyptian Christians. That is to say, there is not a singular experience that you can say all Christians in Egypt have this, whatever it may be. The fact of the matter is Christians in Egypt have different experiences of the country depending on the socioeconomic level they belong to, depending on the province they live in, depending on even the village that they live in. All of these factors can change dramatically the kind of experience that Christians have. Just to give you an example of sort of what would be a kind of a more sort of it's not as common, but it's indicative of something important. I was at an event over the summer. It was a kind of an opera, actually, which a major Christian philanthropist had put on. It was being held in a massive national hall in Egypt. And he paid a lot of money to have this very professional, very well done sort of musical performed about the Holy Family in Egypt. If you don't know exactly what that means, but the idea here is the Holy Family is kind of referencing these stories from the Gospels where Mary and Joseph and Jesus, the baby Jesus, went down into Egypt for a season. It's kind of ambiguous in the Gospels themselves, but this is a significant part of kind of Coptic spirituality. And there's a lot of attention given to this idea. So this opera, or this musical, was produced by this really wealthy Christian philanthropist. Tons of dignitaries were there. Pope Tawadros, the Coptic patriarch, was there. Numerous cabinet members were there. There was a personal greeting from President Sisi to the audience that was read to the audience. So that's a very connected, politically powerful group of people there. Right? These are not beleaguered Christians living in a kind of the ghetto of a village or something like that. These are people that have real power and real wealth in Egypt. And there are a lot of Christians like that. Some of the most wealthy people in Egypt today, the most famous family, of course, is now the Sawiris family. who owns huge chunks of the telecom industry in Egypt. These are Coptic Christians. And so we can't lose sight of that side of things. At the same time, there are a lot of poor, politically and culturally and religiously vulnerable Christians in Egypt as well. And trying to recognize, though, however, that these differences are real, and not trying to sort of kind of conjure up the idea that there's one Christian experience in Egypt, I think is really important if we're going to understand what's going on in the country. Because I can tell you, for example, the religious and national unity narrative, which I introduced, would be something that a lot of those people that were at that event would have been a lot more comfortable with than, say, a Copt living in a village in some part of rural Egypt. So this is one observation. There's not one monolithic experience, and it's divided up oftentimes in a lot of complex ways. But a second point I think that needs to be said here is that there is a pattern. There's a pattern of incidents which are deeply problematic and deeply traumatic to the Christians living there. And this also needs to be mentioned as something that kind of, whatever one's going to say about what Christians are experiencing in Egypt, you can't sort of leave this point out either. This pattern of attacks, of various kinds of terrorist incidents, has kind of been growing, I think it's fair to say, since the 80s and since the 90s. But really, in the last few years, it really seems to have intensified. And so what kinds of incidents, you would have read about these, but it's worth maybe reviewing a few of them. The first, one of the most important was the bombing of the Echidna church in Alexandria, where I think 23 people were killed. You had in 2015 the bombing of the Al-Botrosiyah church in Cairo, where I think 30 people were killed. In 2017, you had the Palm Sunday bombings, one of those in Tanta, which is in the kind of Nile Delta area, one of those in Alexandria, where probably combined 40 or 50 people were killed. In 2017, you had the very tragic, very brutal gunning down of pilgrims who were heading out to a monastery in the kind of desert parts of Upper Egypt. I think in that first attack, there were 25 or 29 people killed. Sadly, a similar, almost an identical kind of attack happened a year later on that same route. And that struck a nerve with me for a lot of different reasons, not just the simple brutality of it, the savageness of people pulling up in cars and mowing down a bus full of pilgrims. But also the fact that I'm almost positive that road comes out of the city that I visited in one of my research projects, and I'm almost positive that I was asked if I wanted to go out to that monastery. And it just made it all the more sort of vivid and tragic for me. So these kinds of incidents are serious, they're significant, they're traumatic, and any account of Christians in Egypt is going to have to recognize that. When you're talking about multiple bombings of holy sites, and people going to Palm Sunday, Easter services, and Christmas services, and things like that, and 20 or 30 people are getting blown apart in a bombing, that's a massive trauma. And even though, as we talk about maybe a few other instances, I think there's a lot of complexity, the brutalness of that, the fear that generates, can hardly be underestimated. And so this is the second kind of point. Now, for those of you who are familiar with Egypt and the Christian experience there, you might be wondering, well, there are other incidents I could have named. So I named these bombings in Alexandria and Cairo and so on. Because there are other incidents. And so, for example, the Kosher Massacre in 2000, where 20 Christians died in kind of riot-like conditions in a village in Egypt. The Nag Hammadi Massacre, in which maybe 9 Christians were gunned down in front of a church in Nag Hammadi. Even Maspiru, which is a much more well-known incident where government vehicles kind of ran over, maybe there were so few people shot as well, ran over a lot of Christians protesting. The reason I haven't listed those in the initial category, and this is something that I don't expect necessarily everyone to agree with, but it's a kind of analytical approach I want to take to it, which is I would classify a lot of these other incidents, and I'm going to talk about some of them briefly, as what I would call like sectarian conflicts or sectarian incidents. And I would distinguish between these and what I described earlier, which I would call much more directly like direct terrorist attacks or direct jihadist attacks. And is the distinction artificial? I don't think it is, but other people may think it is. But I think to fold all of the kind of negative things that happened to Christians in Egypt into kind of one category or one file is going to prevent us from actually understanding some of the complexities of the situation. So, in the case of like Al-Qosha, for example, in 2000, where 20 people died, that has a long prehistory of a couple of years of incidents and various things, various problems between the Muslims and the Christians in the villages, until it finally kind of broke out and there was this kind of riot-like atmosphere. Now that's a horrible thing. That's certainly not something to be sort of dismissive about. But to my mind, it's not quite the same as someone going and planting a bomb in a church on Palm Sunday. The one has a lot of other complex elements to it. So let me just kind of, and I'll close here with a few of these further observations. What kinds of things produce sectarian incidents, what I call sectarian incidents, rather than direct jihadist or terrorist attacks? What kinds of conditions produce those? And they're fairly common. They're not, it's not a huge mystery, the kinds of things they come up, or a lot of them pop up again and again frequently. One would be the question of religious conversions. That can be highly sensitive. This is a really complex issue. It's a hard one. It's kind of a fascinating one in a way, but it's really complex. What can be said about it? Well, my colleague in the Center for Arab West Understanding has done one of the most comprehensive reports on these sort of conversion stories, and it's a really hard thing to get one's mind around. The reason he got involved in all of this was because he was studying claims that Christian women were being kidnapped and kind of forced to convert. And so he started doing research, going out into villages and following leads and trying to find if that's actually true. And he was not able to find any instances in which that actually happened, in which kidnapping would be an actually appropriate word to describe what actually happened. That's not to say there wasn't coercion, that there weren't problems and kind of various social and religious dynamics that were deeply problematic, but for most of us, kidnapping means someone's been taken by force and kind of stuck somewhere and held somewhere against their will, and he's saying that's not what's happening. So what was happening? You had, the kind of situations can be incredibly complex. Let's say a Coptic woman gets involved with a Muslim man and somehow becomes pregnant. Well, that's a problematic situation on some different levels, but what can happen there is unless they get married, then she might not be able to see her child, and so there can be an effort to convert in order to make that, to keep the family kind of together, even though she doesn't maybe really want to, and certainly her family doesn't. And so I think that what goes on in some of those cases is that to cover up the kind of complexities, to cover up some of the shame of these situations, we hear this rhetoric of kidnapping. So this kind of thing can really trigger things. There have been a couple of famous examples of this, actually, which prove, I think, the complexities of it. One was the case of Wafa Konstantin in 2004, who was the wife of a priest who apparently wanted to convert to Islam. And this was hugely problematic in Egyptian society. And basically, it was arranged so that she could kind of be held in a place where Coptic leaders could come and spend a number of days trying to persuade her not to become Muslim. As far as we can tell, the reason she wanted to become Muslim was to get out of what she regarded as an abusive marriage. Right? Now, this is another point when we talk about conversion. Right? Why would a Coptic woman want to do that? Well, because according to a lot of sort of Coptic official leadership, you can't have a divorce unless there's actually a proven case of infidelity. So if you're in a miserable marriage, let's say it's an abusive marriage, you can't get out of that, but you can, conceivably, by becoming Muslim. That's a doorway that's open to people. So this is a really, fascinating and difficult sort of complex of issues. In the case of Wafa Constantine, as far as I'm aware, and if anyone knows differently, I've checked this pretty thoroughly. She was basically taken out to a monastery in the outskirts of a couple of hours in Wadi Natrun, a couple of hours above Cairo, and basically it's not been really heard from since. I don't think anybody thinks she's dead. I don't think that's the case, but there was a sense in which the church stepped in, kind of with the help of the government, and basically just made that problem kind of go away. Now, we don't know what she actually thinks. Maybe she thinks that's all for the good. The problem is, media has not been permitted to talk to her, as far as I'm aware. And so we just don't know what happened. There was another case with a woman named Camelia Shahata, who was also the priest of a Coptic leader, the wife of a Coptic priest. And she was having marital problems, and there was a kind of initial effort to kind of get away, I think, from her family. And actually, in that case, it all worked out. But Muslims, had kind of more sort of extremist Muslims who were kind of in touch with these things, thought it was another Wafa Constantine story. And there was all these kinds of protests and riots I think in Alexandria primarily, even though Camelia Shahata never really wanted to convert at all, in fact was never going to leave. My colleague Cornelis Holzman has met with him, with her husband and their child. There's no question in our mind that she wanted to remain in the marriage, and that's kind of worked out. I think they had to be actually, though, taken out of the country because it became a kind of symbolic issue. The Wafa Constantine story, by the way, also became one of these things that the Islamic State was really referencing in the Egyptian context. So a huge thing that had a lot of complexities to it, dealing with kind of Coptic divorce law and religious freedom, conversion, but ultimately very, very problematic. I could say a lot more about conversion. I think I'll leave it there. Other things that trigger sectarian conflicts, accusations of blasphemy. That's one that'll trigger a sectarian conflict. Of course, probably the biggest is actual conflicts and controversies over church building in various villages and things like that. It's not true that churches can't be built in Egypt. They can be. If you drive around Cairo and the outskirts of Cairo, you will see many big churches being constructed, very obviously. But it does matter when there's other problems in villages and other kind of cities and districts that can trigger something. And so there you get church burnings. And just to kind of show how all these threads can tie together, in the case of, there was a church burning in a village called Marinab, and a church burning in a village called Afti. I think it's Afti or Aftia. And in those two villages, actually, when those churches were burned, that led to Coptic protesters coming into Cairo. This is one of the factors that led to Coptic protesters coming into Cairo in front of, in the Maspero region, which then, of course, was the famous and tragic incident of them being run down by military vehicles. But just to show you how these things can kind of connect, that was really actually, I think, one of the ways really of understanding the background of why were there people marching in front of Maspero in October 2011. It's in part because there were these church burnings that they were protesting. So that's, I think, what I'll kind of stop there. I've probably gone on too long. Mark, what time is it here?
Fine, but next question.
Yeah, so let me just to kind of, just to sort of review just what I was getting at there. I'm suggesting that when we look at these types of incidents, it's worth contemplating sort of dividing or distinguishing between what I would call direct jihadist attacks and that kind of brutal reality and what I'm describing as sectarian incidents, which though they can be very brutal and can lead to really tragic consequences, I would suggest a more complex set of lenses is more appropriate for them, and that to group all of those things together, and perhaps this is one of the reasons that we shouldn't, I don't think, group those together, is because as a whole, the Egyptian government is horrified by these jihadist attacks, these bombings of churches. I don't have any doubt about that. The vast majority of Egyptians are horrified at them. There is a kind of unity there. I think that these are horrible, despicable, abhorrent acts, and that needs to be recognized. The sectarian incidents can also generate a lot of public outcry, but I'm suggesting they're slightly more complex and worth approaching with some different lenses. So I'll stop there. I'll take some questions about all of this. I know that's probably a lot of information. Hopefully it wasn't too boring.
Thank you for all that. It's very interesting. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, please.
I was curious your thoughts about LCC and his motives and how you feel he's doing.
Al-Sisi. Yeah, I mean, you can't get away from talking about the president, Al-Sisi. I've had a lot of mixed feelings, I think as a lot of people have, about what's going on with his government. So part of this, I mean, and I'm not going to go on too long about it. What I think I would say is I do think that it's an authoritarian phase in the history of Egypt right now, and that there's some sharp edges to that. I think people can be caught really unjustly on the wrong side of that. At the same time, I would have to say, and not everyone that I talk about these things with would agree, but I do think Al-Sisi loves the people of Egypt. And I do think he cares about the people of Egypt. I do think he cares even about Christians. So I don't look at him as or his, fellow government officials as a kind of crazy authoritarian sort of zealot or something like that. So that's a bit of I think, does that get at your question at all?
Just curious in the context of what you shared, your thoughts.
Yeah, it's a complicated thing because I work in Egypt, and so it's a little bit difficult to speak about these things. It's hard, actually. It's
impossible.
There's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of pressure, particularly to kind of back that religion, that sort of national and religious unity narrative. But I guess I would say though that he's a complex figure, and I'm certainly saddened and angered by some of the things that are going on, kind of underneath his leadership. At the same time, I can understand why he's in the position that he is, and I can understand why people support him.
I studied Coptic community for a while, and one of the things I was interested in asking you was about the disturbances that have been going on for a long time in the Mideast region in Upper Egypt, constant reading about kidnappings, church burnings, of Christians being killed, and so forth. So shed some light on that.
Yeah, right. Minya is considered one of the most sort of troubled regions, as far as I'm aware. These reports, that's kind of maybe what you're getting at, is what to make of these reports, perhaps. Is that what you're getting at?
I'm just sort of like asking, if they're true, and why this was happening.
I think it's good, as we've learned over the last couple of years, perhaps in the United States, to read news very critically. And I would say that I do think that there's an appetite for in the United States for people kind of reading stories of what I call Muslims behaving badly. And I think people, and I think there's a kind of appetite for that isn't always correct, and there's a kind of appetite for people to feed it. So I'm pretty skeptical. I mean, just by nature, I suppose. But I like to try to find the facts. I mean, having said that, I mean the stories I've gone through already tonight, I think, are indicative of the fact that there are real incidents and real people die. There's no question about that. And they die, and they're oftentimes the perpetrators are not really held accountable. In a lot of these areas in what we call Upper Egypt or rural Egypt, you have these groups called these kind of reconciliation sessions or reconciliation committees, which are meant to deal with these things. And I think a lot of people find that they don't deal with them particularly well. That is, unless it really is a massive crisis in which a lot of people die, in which case it will get up to the upper levels of the kind of judicial system in Egypt. There's these informal kind of approaches. So, yeah, but I mean, help me understand. I just want to make sure I'm getting at what you're asking. Yeah.
I mean, I guess I was sort of, wondering what was behind, some of these things.
Well, okay, let's take an example.
I was thinking about, the issue of talking about illegal churches or things of that sort.
Yeah, the illegal churches issue is a really interesting one. As I said, it really depends on what region you're talking about in Egypt to see whether a church can kind of be built. My own studies have suggested that it's in particular contexts where that becomes problematic, where that is perceived as a kind of, and it's a big deal. I mean, let's keep in mind, even in the United States, where we sort of pride ourselves on our open-mindedness, we have controversies over mosques getting built, right? And people say, well, you can build one here, but not here. You can build one there, but not in the heart of New York, and so on and so forth, because the symbolism of it's too much. You'll get those kinds of discussions in Egypt as well. You'll hear various kind of village councils will say, you can build a church, but don't put a big bright steeple on it, right? We don't want to change the landscape. We don't want to give the impression that this is a kind of Christian town or something like that. So church building issues regularly cause problems, and this is where you will get, there's a kind of cycle, and at some point there will be the accusation. So for example, in I think it's Afia, the story I referenced, I think what you had going on there was you had, there was somebody who was kind of the Copts had like a structure that they were trying to transform into a church without having apparently the proper kind of legal documentation. But they did get permission from the local security forces. So they were kind of moving ahead. And then there was some kind of claim of some sort of romantic or sexual relationship between a Copt and a Muslim in the village. And so these things start mixing together, and all of a sudden you've got a kind of half of a church structure or whatever it was getting burnt down, and then you've got various reprisals, and then someone dies or multiple people die. So there's a kind of cycle that happens with those things.
Yeah, that's what I was asking about.
Yeah. Okay.
Hi. Faith McDonald. I work here. I'm the International Religious Liberty Director. And about 15, 20 years ago, I went to a hearing that Chris Smith and Tom Lantos did on Egypt. And the witness was Lord Alton, who's a friend of mine, David Alton. And he talked about the fact that Christians had to have the permission of the president of Egypt in order to not only build a church, but to repair a toilet, to paint the walls of the church, anything like that. I know that has changed somewhat, but my point and what I would like you to discuss is even these things that we talk about that are complicated and aren't really jihadist action, the result is the same.
Yeah. They're
killing Christians.
Yeah, no, I think, right. I think the result is tragically too often the same. But are you trying to, so you want me to respond to what exactly?
How have things gotten more moderate in terms of who needs to sign off on the documentation?
I don't know exactly where that particular legal stipulation is at. I will say it is strange that this is one of those areas that you can trace back into the sort of Islamic legal tradition, where there were sensitivities about building churches and repairing churches. Now, to make it even more weird, you can also trace that back into Christian legislation, of the Middle Ages about sort of building and repairing synagogues. So this seems to be something that people are anxious about in some respects. But yeah, there does seem to be a presidential decree needed, which seems an awfully odd thing for this. And there are a lot of presidential decrees given. I think there was just a slew of them that were released. I think I heard like 1,000 or something were released recently. But that doesn't seem to be happening in these villages where you really kind of need them. And there does not seem to be the political willpower on the part of the Egyptian government to actually kind of take a stand in those moments. Rather, it seems to be if we can kind of keep people from an all-out, war. If there are a couple of casualties here and there, that's sad. But I think the question that I would ask about it is when and how will the political willpower change on that kind of point? So yeah, I think that's what I would say. I don't know if that's helpful, but this issue that part of what's kind of around in some of these questions is the issue of impunity and holding people accountable for what happens. This is one of the major problems in all of this. That it happens is tragic, but that there's oftentimes these vague and very unsatisfying judgments made on the culprits is really problematic. And just to give you another wrinkle on that, one of the issues that comes up here is because Egyptian security so often is kind of plain clothes. It's a long story, but you've got the formally clothed police officers, but there's a lot of the most important people are actually not wearing official uniforms. And because that whole apparatus is so secretive and yet so important, it's very hard to hold anybody particularly accountable. I mean, it's very difficult. I mean, this is one of the big questions that comes up in a lot of these incidents is where was security? Well, security, is the most secretive aspect of kind of the Egyptian sort of government. And so it becomes really problematic when you've got these key figures who you kind of don't even know who they are. Though people in the villages would know, there's no doubt about that, but it's just, it shows how many layers there are kind of preventing people from getting at the truth. Yeah.
So I have a couple of questions, but I like your idea that there's no monolithic experience of a Copt in Egypt. But based on your background and your work in the field, what are your thoughts on like the average Coptic experience of four narratives? Let's say in Shobra, in Cairo, like the typical average Egyptian Copt. What are your thoughts on what would they say out of the four narratives? And the second part of the question is, do you have any advice for Copts in the Diaspora on some of the things that could possibly be done to maybe help get the narrative right?
On the first part of the question, obviously I wouldn't presume to speak. I've learned enough about Egypt to know that there isn't really one monolithic experience. But I mean, I would say that part of what I've learned to do is ask as many people as I can how they perceive things. And you do hear surprising answers. I mean, one of the villages that I've worked with is a village called Magaga, which is down in Upper Egypt. And there you have a Coptic priest who has a very strikingly positive relationship with the Salafi Sheikh. Okay, these are people I've worked with and met personally on numerous occasions. Father Ioannis and Sheikh Hamdi Abdel Fattah. And so there's a village where really there are resources among people to kind of deal with stuff that comes up in rather impressive ways because of that personal relationship. If you go the next village over, or the two villages down, it might not be that way. And there you're going to find really kind of the types of things we've been talking about. So that would be one thing, is I really do believe that, I'll give you another example. I was talking with a relatively well-known Christian musician, a Coptic musician, while I was in Cairo last. And I was just asking him about his experience as a person who of some fame and so on. And I just said, so your problems, with the country, where do they come from? He said, I've had less problems. I said, I've had no problems with the government. I've had no problems with Muslims. And my main problems have been with the church, because he's a Christian musician, of course, and some of his kind of posture has not been received well. But you hear those kinds of testimonies. I wasn't fishing for that. I literally thought he would tell me, well, there was this problem, there was that problem, but that was his experience. You got to take that seriously. So, yeah, on the kind of Coptic diaspora question, I mean, this is a controversial issue within Egypt and outside of Egypt. The government doesn't always take well some of the pictures, the images of Egypt that are portrayed to the international community from some of these folks living outside. At the same time, I believe many of them do it according to what they believe is true and is according to their convictions, and there's no way to really, I mean, I can hardly but sympathize with some of the sort of situations that they find themselves in. So I guess, yeah, I think there's enough evidence that, Christians and Muslims have no problem blaming each other as sort of and kind of doing that as sweepingly as they can. So I think to be aware of that reality that's been going on for about 1,000 years, just kind of pointing the finger at reality, I think it's worth keeping in mind for people if they're going to be working in this field. On the conversion thing, as I was mentioning, for when Copts are converting to Islam, you get this rhetoric of kidnapping, right? So you're blaming the other. It's not because of anything wrong in your community. And for the Muslims, so far as I've been able to tell, you oftentimes, if people are converting, you'll get the kind of accusation of material inducement, right? So there's nothing wrong with your community. It's these people are offering them money or maybe ways out of the country or other things. That's why they convert. In both cases, those narratives prevent each other from looking at what's going on, I think, more realistically.
What are some different political approaches that the Christian community takes in order to get their interests realized?
Yeah, the politics of the Christian community in Egypt is an interesting question. It's one that I'm still trying to get my mind around, really. At one level, there is a lot of deference shown to the state. There's no question, and the officials of the state. There have been times in history where, particularly Pope Shenouda, the previous Coptic patriarch, took pretty hard stances in protesting what he perceived, injustices, abuses. One of those got him into trouble, so that he got stuck out in a monastery for 3 or 4 years by Anwar Sadat, and then Hosni Mubarak, the next president, kept up that for a few years. So Shenouda was kind of unpredictable. Shenouda, when he felt that it was necessary to take a kind of stance, he would do that. But I would certainly say, in general, it's a fairly passive political orientation. For whatever that's worth, that's my impression. Okay.
Sort of thinking about the possibility of a fifth or some different narrative that might gain adherence, particularly among Muslims, but also the Coptic community there. And I'm just wondering if there are any kind of historical resources within Egypt that would, be sort of create a stacked story or background of a more tolerant society. I know, before the, early 50s, there was a period of British colonialism, which is not great for Egyptian sentiment. And then before that, you had the Ottomans, and they're Turks, they're not Arabs, and so forth. But I think at least during that period, or there may have been more tolerance toward Christians than currently. And there are some Muslim majority countries in the world. I'm thinking of more Central Asian. There's at least 1 or 2 examples out there where there is a fair amount of harmony between Christians and Muslims. So I'm just wondering if there might be a possibility that another narrative that could accommodate both to some degree and be a more hopeful direction.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I mean, are there models? I mean, of more healthy relations. I mean, there are. I mean, for example, in Lebanon, I think it's fair to say that that's a totally different situation, and so the Islamic world is not a monolith on this stuff at all. But it's difficult to see exactly the way forward. I mean, I think I'm not, what you're referencing, that kind of golden liberal period of the 1920s, 1930s, that was a unique moment in Egypt's history. Whether or not that has any realistic chance of kind of being recaptured at this point, I'm not sure. It doesn't seem to me like that has enough traction as a vision for the people. So I would like to think that creative and good-hearted people, both Christians and Muslims in Egypt, are going to, at some point, provide some kind of new path that will be more hopeful. As it stands now, there's a lot of good things. I mean, I see a lot of good things, and part of what I try to do is actually, and I haven't done it tonight particularly, but talk about those good things. And there's a lot of movement, and there's a lot of love for the country that transcends religious borders. That I think is there's a lot of possibility there, but it's going to be a hard road. That's my fear right now. Yeah, Katie, were you going to say something?
Yeah, thank you. From your perspective, do you think that any of these narratives are based on geography or socioeconomic status?
I do think they have. They can be deeply shaped by geography and socioeconomic status. Yes. Absolutely. I mean, if you're living in provinces that are 80 to 90% Muslim, you're going to have a particular view of what makes sense in Egypt. If you're living in the kind of amongst the urban elites in Cairo, you're going to have a particular view about what makes sense in Egypt. So those things matter a lot, and so I do. I think that's a big piece of it, and I think that those socioeconomic and geographical factors, once you start taking those into consideration, I think some things kind of become clearer as to what's happening in the country, rather than sort of having one narrative that sort of explains all of it, which I think fails pretty dramatically.
Thanks so much. This country situations are so specific, it's hard to generalize. But coming from the perspective of Iraq and Syria over the last decade, there is nonetheless the sense that in the absence of those autocratic regimes, there's no space just for the Christians. I mean, the opposition very often has turned to be Islamic, right? And so the Christians are stuck in that very tragic dilemma where in Syria, for example, under the Obama administration, position on Syria was, okay, well, if they don't take a stand against the regime, we can help them. That's changed a little bit in Iraq with the new administration, but there is sort of this, and as a result, there's an exodus. And I wonder if you see there's this kind of doom scenario in the absence of an autocratic regime, in fact, because of the strand of Islam, that in political Islam, Christians are more or less doomed.
Yeah.
And if you can speak to that a little bit, or if you can observe a similar situation already, there's more resilience and more space.
Yeah, well, I mean, as I understand your question, I think this is something that needs to be discussed, which is the close relationship between a lot of Christian communities in the Middle East with these regimes that, on most other accounts, people are raising real serious questions about their morality and their legitimacy and so on. That is an issue that I think is probably could use some attention, at the very least to understand. That would be the argument, I think, among a lot of Christians in Egypt, would be that, listen, we're not thrilled about some of the authoritarian dynamics of our country right now. At the same time, when we look at these other possibilities, they're potentially horrifying, and
they've been horrifying.
And they've been horrifying, yeah.
And they still are.
Right. So that's tough. That's just a really tough bind to know what to do with. I mean, right? And I certainly don't pretend to have any easy answers about it. It's a very hard thing.
We have time for just two more questions, so the two of you.
I don't know, as part of your research, if you have had the time to sit and talk with government officials about what is their view in terms of their strategy on improving or
Yes.
relationship.
Yeah, no, I have. Yeah.
No, because the sense that I think most Egyptians have is that the government always prefers what they call the security solution, the reconciliation talks basically put out the fire. They don't care about the long-term solution. They just want to keep peace, and that's all they care about. So I don't know if you have.
Yeah, I have spoken with a number of government officials, and it's always interesting to hear what they have to say. You know, in many cases they will paint a somewhat brighter picture, but at the same time, I mean, in my conversations with them, they're not trying to sweep things under the carpet either. They recognize that they're some very talented politicians and government officials in a place like Egypt, and so yeah, that's certain. I've had a lot of those conversations. Sometimes I've encountered folks who have wanted, they don't know why I would be interested in Christian-Muslim relations. They think that's kind of a problematic line of research that just isn't going to do anybody any good. They're like, why would you do that? You know, like, this is just a kind of, ultimately, like, it's basically working okay, and you trying to sort of figure this out is not going to help anybody. That's not been my impression, honestly, looking at these issues. But the security thing that you mentioned is really important, because to understand that, I think, helps us understand something about Egypt. I mean, in the case of Egypt, you might go in there as, say, a foreigner and have a really great idea that you think would be helpful or something like that. And because there's that security kind of inclination, it doesn't matter. The fact is that could lead to something bad. So, I could go in some of my research and say, listen, I want to, portray this village, the harmonious existence between Muslims and Christians. Won't it be great? And it might well really be great. And like a security kind of minded approach will just say, no. Like, it's possible that could lead to something bad. And particularly you as an American coming and asking or doing anything could lead to something bad. So even though I think, it might be good, let's just not do it. So that's a big kind of issue, is that kind of, it sort of stifles a lot, I think, because there's that inclination. Was there one more?
Yeah. Thanks for the four narratives. I think that's helpful. And I appreciate your point about being precise about language and how to categorize incidents and so on. Kidnapping is not necessarily the same thing as coercion, but still coercion is obviously a significant problem. It may not be that much of a consolation whether something is categorized to people who are facing that coercion. Of course, the language can be inflammatory, so we want to avoid that type of language that can inflame sectarian violence. But does that get to sort of the human rights narrative? And maybe I think of this since I'm a lawyer, but I guess does it suggest the importance of religious freedom rights? And I think of the book by The Price of Freedom Tonight by Ryan Rin, Roger Fink, I think.
Yeah.
And how they talk about how the more you have the right of religious freedom and rights sort of built into the law, the less religious violence the country will have based on their studies and for a variety of reasons. And so I wondered what your take is on that, and if you can also look to elements in Islam to build support for that.
Yeah.
The Marrakesh Declaration, the concept of human dignity in Islam.
Yeah.
And the idea that there is no coercion in religion, whatever it may be.
Yeah, right.
Hadith may say.
Yeah, and I'll have this be the last question. You guys have been very patient. So, yeah, I think it does matter. That language of kidnapping and coercion and so on, I think does matter, in the sense that I do think it fits into certain narratives about what's going on in the region that aren't accurate. I mean, kidnapping means what we think it means. Somebody is being taken. I think physically. Now, the coercive elements, those are incredibly complex. I mean, when you've got romantic relationships that go badly and things like that, I mean, it's just an incredibly complex situation. You've got people that are living in extreme poverty, for example, and kind of find a way out, possibly through some kind of relationship and things like that can then turn coercive and abusive. But kidnapping seems to miss a lot of that and just kind of put the blame on sort of bad Muslims, and I don't think that's very helpful. But to come to your point about religious freedom, and this is something I think about a lot. What are the prospects for religious freedom? What would be its value in these kinds of situations? I mean, I think one has to recognize that in huge parts of Egypt, there's going to be a long road towards the kinds of values that we would sort of maybe as Americans consider sort of religious freedom. There are a lot, not only just from Muslims, but Copts as well. The idea that your son or daughter or relative can change religions is a big thing. Now, we still find that, actually, I sometimes point out to Americans, we still find that to be the case in America. I mean, I come from a family that, for better or worse, if I announce next week I'm becoming Muslim, they would be really shocked, and it would be deeply traumatic, right? So, we can relate at some level, but it's that times like 10, or even more in some of these, particularly some of these villages and so on, where a lot of Egyptians live. So I think one has to recognize that's going to be a difficult road, but I think a valuable one. And I think ultimately, the hope is that they're going to become people in Egypt and leadership in Egypt that is going to have the political will to push some of those things forward. And that's going to be costly. I mean, this is part of what I'm getting at. That's going to be costly. Right now, it's kind of a security solution, whereas if you can just get people to calm down, everything's okay. But if you have a situation where you've got government officials saying, we are going to defend the rights of this person, say, leaving this religion and transferring to another, there's going to be major blowback against that kind of thing. And yet, I think, we can hope that there will be a sort of political will for that. So, having said that, in a perfect world, I think, religious freedom has a lot to offer these environments, a more robust sense of it, no doubt. But in my impression, it's not going to come easily. And I think to realize that is important. So those are my thoughts. But thank you again for your patience. Thank you, Mark, for hosting me.
Thank you, Matthew. Great comments and much to ponder and contemplate and pray about. And hopefully you'll be writing an article for Providence summarizing what you've shared here.
Maybe so.
This evening. In finale, we're going to have a very brief presentation on the Philos project from the wonderful Ashley Muse. So, Ashley?
Hi everyone, my name is Ashley. I'm a research analyst at the Philos Project, and we help publish Providence with IRD. And I wanted to let you know about our current advocacy campaign, which is actually about Coptic Christians. So the Coptic Leadership Initiative provides educational resources about Coptic history, their belief systems, their various contributions to Christianity and to the world. And so I want to encourage you to visit our website. It's philosproject.org/cops. And you can explore, learn more. We have a bunch of different resources for you there. Also, the local Philos chapter here in DC is going to be putting on some events in the coming weeks that will allow you to engage with the local Coptic community here in DC. So we'll be visiting local Coptic churches, meeting with Coptic experts. So if you're interested in that, please feel free to find me afterwards, or you can also shoot me an email, ashley@philosproject.org, and I'd be happy to get you involved. So thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, everybody.